Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The cabin in the woods that knows my secrets. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. Arrival in the Woods. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel with a tightness that made her knuckles pale. It was the kind of grip you only had when you were running from something, an invisible weight pressing on your chest, each breath more labored than the last. She glanced at the rearview mirror, but there was nothing but the endless stretch of trees behind her. No city lights, no noise, just the silence of the woods. The cabin was supposed to be a retreat, an escape. And yet, as she pulled up the long, winding driveway, a strange sensation settled in her gut. She couldn't place it. This place was too perfect. Nestled deep in the heart of the forest, the cabin sat there, alone, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to stretch to the sky. It looked like something out of a postcard, idyllic and peaceful. But something was wrong. Something felt off. Sarah parked the car and stepped out, the air crisp and cool, smelling of pine and damp earth. She looked around, taking in the stillness. It was too quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just nothing. The silence pressed against her eardrums, almost suffocating. She shivered and tightened her coat around her. The cabin itself was charming in a worn-down way, with its wooden exterior faded by years of exposure to the elements. The door was slightly ajar, as though it hadn't been used in years. Yet, there was an unsettling feeling that someone had been here recently. A tidy, almost manicured patch of grass surrounded the cabin, as though it were tended to regularly, though no one had lived there for months or maybe even years. Inside, the air was stale and thick. She stepped in, her boots making small echoes as they hit the wooden floor. The first thing she noticed was the photo on the mantel, a family portrait. The image was faded, the people's smiles frozen in time, but there was something wrong. The faces were blurry, distorted, as though they were trying to shift away from the camera, as if they didn't want to be remembered. Sarah stared at it, feeling a sinking sensation in her stomach. She stepped deeper into the cabin. On the kitchen table lay an old, rusted key with strange engravings etched into the metal. A journal, its pages yellowed with age tucked away in a dusty corner. She reached for it, flipping it open, but something in the back of her mind warned her to stop. Later that night, after the shadows had fallen long, the first noise came. A soft scraping, as though something were gently dragging itself across the floor beneath her. Sarah froze. She told herself it was the house settling. But then came the scratching again, louder this time. And that was when she saw it, a shadow creeping just beyond the window's edge. Her heart pounded. Maybe it was just the wind. Or maybe, just maybe, the cabin knew more about her than it should. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Past. The wind howled outside, rattling the old window panes like restless spirits. Sarah sat at the cabin's table, staring at the old photo she had found. The family in the frame, smiling, posed, looked too familiar, but she couldn't quite place them. Her heart raced as she studied their faces, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. She set the photo down with trembling hands. Just a coincidence, she told herself. The cabin seemed to grow heavier with every minute she spent inside. The stillness was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the wind crashing against the walls. She pulled her jacket tighter around her and stood, pacing restlessly. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She had come here to escape, to confront the past, but now it was as if the past had followed her, dragging shadows along the floor. She decided to explore the cabin further, hoping to distract herself from the unease gnawing at her. Upstairs, the air smelled of dust and old wood, but there was something else, a faint, bitter scent of decay, as though time had forgotten this place. The walls were lined with wooden beams, but as she moved closer, she noticed something else. Carvings, strange, intricate symbols etched into the wood lines, circles, and shapes that twisted into grotesque forms. The symbols didn't make sense at first, but as her eyes adjusted, a pattern emerged, an eerie connection to her own memories. There were markings of a tree, a face, and a figure that seemed to be falling. Her heart skipped. The woods. Her childhood had been filled with long walks through the forest near her home. She remembered one walk in particular, the night she had gone missing for hours, wandering in circles until she had found her way home, shaken and terrified. Had this cabin been here then? A voice whispered her name, a soft, almost tender sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat. She spun around, but there was no one. The cabin was still. She was alone. Wasn't she? She hurried down the stairs, but as she passed the window, she saw it, a fleeting figure, a silhouette standing in the trees. The woods were thick with darkness, but she swore she saw a face staring back at her, the eyes wide and hollow. Was it her imagination, or was something out there, something that knew her? Her pulse quickened. She felt watched, but when she looked again, there was nothing, only the dense, cold blackness of the forest. Paranoia, she thought, but the fear gnawed at her deeper than ever. Something wasn't right, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this cabin was tied to her, connected to the things she had tried so desperately to forget. Chapter 3. The Key and the Door. The night had settled in again, thicker this time, as though the forest itself was trying to swallow the cabin whole. Sarah sat on the couch, her hands trembling around a cup of lukewarm coffee she barely tasted. She had always been a skeptic, someone who believed in logic, in explanations. But now, with the whispers, the strange carvings, and the shadows moving outside the window, she wasn't so sure anymore. After hours of pacing, she had gone down to the basement, trying to distract herself from the unnerving feeling that the cabin was somehow alive, watching her. That's when she had found it. Half buried under a pile of old firewood, her hand brushed against something cold. A small metal object buried in the dirt, a key. It was old, rusted, its edges jagged, but it was undeniably a key. She picked it up and examined it, her heart pounding. No labels, no markings, but something about it felt wrong, like it was meant to be here. Hesitant, Sarah turned and approached the corner of the basement, where the wall met the floor. There, hidden in the shadow, was a door. Wooden, almost camouflaged by the dirt and grime of years. The keyhole glimmered faintly, beckoning her. Her hand hovered over the key. It felt cold in her palm, and the air around her seemed to tighten with every second. What was she about to uncover? She swallowed hard, her heart racing. With a deep breath, she slid the key into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing the darkness behind it. Inside, the room was suffocating, a cluttered, forgotten place. Old boxes of personal items stacked to the ceiling. Books, their pages yellowed with age. Everything covered in a thick layer of dust. But it wasn't the items that made her heart skip, was what she found at the back of the room. A doll, old, rotting. Its eyes blackened and cracked, its once soft fabric now torn and stained. She recoiled, but couldn't look away. Nearby, a child's drawing lay folded, smeared with something that resembled red ink. In the drawing, a family stood together, but their faces were twisted, their eyes hollow, as if the child had captured something horrific in their art. As Sarah stepped closer, her vision blurred, and the room seemed to shift. She found herself running, through the woods. Her breath ragged, her legs heavy as something chased her. When she turned around, the thing behind her, it was her. A younger version of herself, eyes wide with terror. She blinked, and the room snapped back into focus. The cabin was changing, shifting. Memories long buried began to resurface, details she hadn't thought about in years. The smell of the trees, the sound of the leaves crunching underfoot, and then the night she had gone missing, lost in these very woods, without any memory of how she had found her way home. Was it coincidence, or was the cabin pulling her into the past? The same past she had spent so long running from. Chapter 4. The Cabin Knows. Sarah's hands shook as she set the old diary back on the dusty shelf in the hidden room. The words blurred in her mind. She had skimmed through it in a day's torn pages, filled with the ramblings of a woman who had once lived here. The woman's name was Evelyn, and as Sarah read the journal, the unease gnawing at her deepened. Evelyn had gone mad, or so it seemed. She had written about the cabin, about how it held her memories hostage, how the walls whispered to her in her darkest moments. Sarah laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Crazy woman," she muttered under her breath. But even as she said it, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was listening. Cabin had grown darker since she found the hidden door. It felt heavier, almost suffocating. She could hear it now, the whispers. Faint, like the wind rustling through the trees, but layered beneath that, a soft, disembodied voice calling her name. Sarah, over and over, until it felt like the air was vibrating with it. "Is it in my head?" she thought, her pulse quickening. The floorboards creaked, loud and deliberate, as though someone were pacing in the room above her. She froze, staring up at the ceiling, trying to make out the rhythm of the steps. It wasn't the house settling. No, this was different. This was something purposeful. Her breathing hitched. She turned, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was nothing. Just the flickering shadows of the dim cabin. With a nervous laugh, she stumbled backward. "Get a grip, Sarah," she muttered, but even as she spoke, her instincts screamed at her. Something isn't right. She darted to the front door, hoping to step outside and clear her head. Maybe a breath of fresh air would help her calm down. But as she opened the door, the world outside wasn't what she expected. The woods loomed, dark and impenetrable. The trees stretched too far, their branches twisted into monstrous shapes. She stepped forward, but every path she took led her deeper into the forest, not toward the town as she had expected. "It's like the forest is alive," she thought, her heart pounding in her chest. "Like it's trapping me." She spun around, desperate to return to the cabin, but it felt as though the trees were closing in on her. The air was thick, damp, and heavy with something that wasn't right. And somewhere beneath it all, the whispering began again. "Sarah, Sarah." It was a voice she recognized, but it wasn't hers. And that's when she realized the cabin knew her. More than it should. Chapter 5. The Truth in the Mirror. The cabin had taken on a life of its own. Sarah felt its eyes on her, watching from the corners of every room. Each step she took seemed like it echoed with 1,000 others, like invisible feet followed her, never quite in sync with her own. She was trapped, and the walls knew it. Frantic, she pushed through a door she hadn't noticed before, her breath shallow and ragged. Inside was a small, dimly lit room, its air thick with the scent of mildew and old wood. Against the far wall stood a large mirror, its surface covered in grime and dust, as though it hadn't been touched in years. Something about it felt wrong, yet she couldn't pull herself away. She wiped the dust from the glass, her hand trembling as it revealed her reflection. But it wasn't her. Not entirely. The face staring back at her was a grotesque version of herself. Older, haggard, her eyes sunken with fear. Her reflection smiled at her, lips cracked and stretched unnaturally wide. Sarah staggered back, her heart hammering. But the image didn't disappear. Instead, it began to shift, morphing into twisted memories she had long buried. In the mirror, she saw herself arguing with her ex, the night their relationship had shattered like glass. But it was distorted. His face was contorted, hateful, and her own eyes gleamed with guilt. The mirror flickered again, showing her as a child, standing alone in the woods, crying. But the trees around her weren't just trees. They were alive, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Her chest tightened as another memory surfaced, one she had buried deep. A friend from years ago, someone she had left behind. Someone she had abandoned. The reflection in the mirror warped, her friend's face blending into her own, pleading eyes staring back at her. No. Sarah turned away, but the mirror wouldn't let her go. She felt its pull, like it was tethered to her soul. The cabin itself seemed to shift, the floor creaking under the weight of something far older, far darker. She tried to run, but every door led her back to the same room. The same mirror. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by something else, a presence. A shadow in the corner of her vision, moving in time with her breaths. The cabin wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it knew her deepest secrets. She stopped, her back pressed against the wall, eyes darting around the room. The entity, whatever it was, wasn't just in the shadows anymore. It was everywhere. Every step she took, every breath she made, it followed. Her past mistakes, her guilt, her fears, they had manifested into something real. Was this her punishment, or was she slowly losing her mind? In the mirror, her reflection smiled again, but this time its lips whispered, "You can't run. You never could." Chapter 6. Confronting the Past. The nights had become endless. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she had truly slept. Each time she closed her eyes, she was plunged into a world where reality bled into nightmare. The cabin was no longer just a place. It was a living, breathing prison, feeding off her fear, her memories. In one of these nightmares, she was a child again, running through the woods, her feet bare and bleeding from sharp branches. Someone called her name, but the voice was twisted, hollow. She turned and saw her father, his face twisted in anger, just as it had been the night he disappeared from her life. "It's your fault," his voice echoed in her mind. "You brought me here." She woke with a start, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. But the nightmare didn't fade. The cabin seemed to pulse around her, breathing in time with her ragged breaths. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. Sarah stumbled out of bed, the world around her spinning. "I'm losing it," she thought. "I'm going mad." Her hands trembled as she reached for the dusty desk in the corner of the room. There, half buried under a pile of forgotten letters and torn pages, was an old, weathered envelope, its edges frayed, its paper yellowed with age. Her name was scrawled across the front in familiar handwriting, but it made her stomach twist. She hesitated before tearing it open. The letter inside was brief, but each word felt like a punch to the gut. It was from someone she had once loved deeply, someone who had known her better than anyone. The letter spoke of secrets, of things she had buried, It told of a night years ago when Sarah had been to this very cabin. A night she had forgotten or forced herself to forget. But now, the cabin wouldn't let her forget. It had trapped her here, forcing her to relive everything she had run from. "You were always meant to come back," the letter read. "This place holds your truth. Her pulse quickened, her hands shaking violently as she reread the final line. "You're not a victim, Sarah. You never were." She dropped the letter, backing away from the desk as if it had burned her. The walls whispered to her now, louder than before, voices swirling in the dark. She stumbled to the door, desperate to escape, but every time she tried, the cabin pulled her back. The cabin was judging her. Had it always been? Her chest tightened. She no longer knew if she was awake or trapped in another nightmare. The line between the past and present blurred as memories she had long buried clawed their way to the surface. Was it the cabin, or was it her mind unraveling under the weight of her guilt? Chapter 7. The Final Night. The night had teeth. It bit into Sarah's skin as she stood in the center of the cabin, the air thick with something primal, something wrong. The walls groaned, almost like they were shifting, breathing, alive. Every shadow twisted into grotesque shapes, moving like predators in the dark, waiting. The cabin had transformed, no longer just four walls, but a living entity, feeding off her terror, growing stronger with each panicked breath she took. The floorboards creaked under her feet, though she hadn't moved. Lights flickered and dimmed, plunging the room into a sickly half-light. Her reflection in the window warped, distorting her face into something unrecognizable. She staggered, clutching the back of a chair as the room seemed to spin around her. Furniture shifted, the sound of wood scraping against wood, screeching in her ears. Doors slammed shut in rapid succession, trapping her inside a cage that tightened with every second. This can't be real. But it was. Every step she took, the cabin responded, doors that led nowhere, walls that closed in on her, like it was trying to consume her whole. Her own heartbeat thudded in her ears, a frantic rhythm that matched the cabin's pulse. From somewhere in the shadows, a voice hissed her name. Sarah. She whirled, heart racing, but there was no one there. Just shadows. Shadows that crept closer with each flicker of the lights. It felt like the cabin itself was watching, waiting for her to make a move, to break. No more, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. You won't break me. The whispering stopped. Silence fell over the cabin, thick and suffocating. And then, out of the dark, it emerged. A figure tall, twisted, its form barely human, stepped forward, its face hidden in the shadows. But Sarah knew. She had always known. The entity wasn't just the cabin, it was her. Her guilt. Her past. Every terrible thing she had tried to bury had taken form in this thing. It's time, the figure rasped, its voice like dead leaves scraping across the floor. Sarah's legs felt weak. Time for what? For you to face what you've done. Her breath caught in her throat. The memories flashed her father, her lost friend, the mistakes she had made, all the people she had left behind. Her deepest shame, the thing she had buried so deep she had forgotten. The night she ran from this very cabin, leaving someone behind, someone who never made it out. I didn't mean to. Her voice cracked, the words choking her. The entity's hollow eyes bore into her. But you did. Cabin groaned, the walls seeming to fold in on her, trapping her in this moment. Sarah felt the weight of it all pressing down on her, the crushing truth she had avoided her entire life. She had been running from herself, and now there was no more running. The cabin wasn't just a place. It was her prison, a prison built from her own memories, her own guilt. She had to confront it, or she would be trapped forever. With trembling hands, she stepped forward, staring the entity down. I'm not afraid of you anymore, she whispered, though her voice shook. The figure didn't move, but the air around her seemed to shift. The cabin quivered, the walls rippling like water, and for the first time, the darkness began to pull back. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about acceptance. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. The cabin was still. The air no longer crackled with malevolence, and the oppressive darkness that had suffocated Sarah seemed to retreat like a tide pulling back. She stood in the center of the room, her body trembling, her breath shallow. The entity, the twisted reflection of her guilt, was gone. The figure had dissolved into the shadows after she'd confronted it, but the memory of its hollow eyes lingered, burning in her mind. She was alone now, but the silence was deafening. The cabin had shown her everything, her darkest secrets, the truths she had buried so deep they had nearly consumed her. But she was still standing. Somehow, she had survived. Her legs felt weak as she stumbled toward the front door, every step an agonizing reminder of the fight she had just endured. The door creaked open with an almost reluctant groan, as if the cabin itself wasn't ready to let her go. Outside, the forest was eerily calm. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches no longer reaching for her like skeletal hands. The air smelled fresher here, untouched by the suffocating decay of the cabin's interior. She took a step out onto the porch, her heart pounding as she breathed in the cool night air. I made it. I'm free. But was she? As Sarah walked away from the cabin, her body stiff and sore, her mind was far from free. The images that had assaulted her, the nightmares, the memories still clung to her, replaying over and over in her mind. Her father's face, twisted in rage. The friend she had left behind. Cabin's dark grip on her past would never truly let go, she realized. Even if she walked away, the memories had rooted themselves too deeply. She reached the edge of the forest, the cabin now just a distant shadow behind her. But when she glanced back, a shiver ran down her spine. The windows of the cabin gleamed in the moonlight, reflecting her face back at her warped, distorted, just like in the mirror. It watched her still, waiting. Sarah knew she would never escape. Not really. The cabin had forced her to confront the parts of herself she had been running from her whole life, and while she had faced them, the scars they left were permanent. She would carry them forever. But she had survived. For now. As she turned and walked down the path leading away from the woods, the sound of a car's engine reached her ears. She froze, turning toward the road. A lone car pulled up the dirt path, headlights cutting through the night. A figure stepped out, a man, his face obscured in the shadows. He glanced up at the cabin, curiosity and unease in his posture. Sarah's breath caught. The cycle was beginning again. The cabin would always be there, waiting. It knew her secrets, and now it would know his. The forest swallowed her as she disappeared into the night, but the cabin remained, watching. Always watching.